Good morning, rock stars. Welcome back to String and Story. My name is HollyAnne Knight, and it's my job to guide you to quote with confidence. Welcome to our weekly mini workshop. Today, we're going to be talking about foundation paper piecing, and this is the first of a two-part introduction. Today, we're going to specifically be talking about what is foundation paper piecing, often called FPP. Why would we use it? What supplies do we need? And what kind of projects can we make using this technique? So if you are here with me live or watching the replay, do go ahead and say hi down in the comments. All right, I am so excited. So before we actually jump into today's slide deck, let me just go ahead and let you know about two resources that I have for you in the caption of this video. The first is going to be a link over to my blog. In fact, let me make sure that I'm looking at the right ones here. Yes. First is going to be a link over to my blog. We're going to be working from the same blog both today and next week. So right now I'm going to be talking through kind of why FPP, what supplies do we need, all of that. You'll see on the blog there's already some tutorial steps up for you. Next week there's actually going to be a video tutorial about how to make your first foundation paper piece block if you're new to this technique. The other link you're going to find in the caption of this video is a link to my pattern shop. Several of the patterns that I'm going to show you today that use FPP are ones that I designed. So I've provided that link for you. So if you're excited to get started with foundation paper piecing and you're looking for a beginner-friendly pattern, you can find those resources, okay? All right, so today, welcome to Intro to Foundation Paper Piecing. Like I said, this is the first of a two-part series that I'm doing. To give you guys the big picture, the plan from here is I'm going to give you guys kind of the background about FPP today. Next week, I'm going to actually show you how to do it because my big project for the month of October is I am trying to finish my Kinship quilt top because I want to talk about quilting it with you guys as soon as possible. I think that's going to be such a fun conversation. With that's going to be, talking about traditional blocks, talking about long arming, talking about making quilting plans for a sampler. I've got lots of things I want to share with you guys that are more on that quilting side of things, which is my zone of genius when it comes to teaching quilting techniques. But this is some nice background knowledge as you're maybe working on projects of your own, looking for a new technique to try out, etc. Okay, so let's jump in. In this mini workshop, I'm going to introduce you to foundation paper piecing, a technique for creating sharp edges and piecing interesting shapes. FPP is sometimes called the Ginger Rogers of piecing because, you have to do it backwards. And high heels always look good too. If you're not familiar with the quote that I'm playing off of here, there's a quote in the dance world that talks about the excellence of Ginger Rogers because she did everything that Fred Astaire did, but she had to do it backwards and she had to do it in high heels, right? So when we're working with foundation paper piecing, we have the paper facing up towards us. The right side of our fabric is facing away. And there can be a little bit of a mind game as you think through, okay, I have to have my fabric positioned here in order to sew the seam. And when I flip it open, how is it going to fill that space, etc. It is not hard, but it is different. And if you're like me, it can be challenging to slow down enough to do it well until you kind of hit a rhythm with it. But the results are very rewarding. You can see here, and I'm going to give you examples throughout our time together this morning. These are some pretty tiny pieces, right? I'm not 100% sure if you guys can see my mouse, but if you can, this diamond is a shape. And then these are setting triangles, and these are all very little. These blocks are 4.5 inches, right? These are tiny little blocks. It would be very, very difficult to actually rotary cut those bits out. But using this foundation paper piecing technique, we can get very precise, very gorgeous, even small pieces, okay? Good morning, everyone. I really love foundation paper piecing too, so I'm pretty excited about this. All right, so next week I'm gonna actually show you how to foundation paper piece. So if you're new to it and you're like, but how do I do it? It's coming, I promise. But I wanna give you kind of some background knowledge that answer some of the questions that I had when I first started foundation paper piecing. Even things like, why do people think it's hard? Like, why is it a bit of a mind bender? And are there tools that will make it easier? And the answer is yes, there are tools that'll make it easier. And just, I think, simply understanding how it's a useful technique, that it's not something that we necessarily do for the sake of doing it, but there are times when that can be fun if you're wanting precision without having to do all the cutting ahead of time. But specifically, we use foundation paper piecing when we've got weird shapes that are hard to rotary cut, right? All right, so what is foundation paper piecing? Foundation paper piecing, or FPP, is a technique that uses paper, foundation paper, to stabilize your fabric as you piece it together so you can get very precise seams and shapes, even when working with teeny tiny pieces of fabric. So foundation papers look something like this. The interior shapes are numbered and marked with solid lines. You start by positioning the fabric for that number 1 shape, and you work up to the highest number. So what I'm going to show you guys with this block next week is we start by deciding what we want to be in the center of this square and a square block, and we'll pin that in place. And then we position the fabric that's going to fill that number 2 triangle. And we sew them right sides together and flip it out. And we repeat with number 3, with number 4, with number 5, and we work our way out, okay? And as I mentioned, like these are very small shapes. This is a 4.5 inch unfinished block. So all those shapes inside there, tiny little bits, right? On most templates, you will also see an additional dotted line around the outside of the entire shape. That's the final seam allowance, right? So that last solid line is where the block will end once it's pieced into your quilt. The dotted line shows the seam allowance in order for that final piecing to take place. Yes, there are other things you can use as a foundation as well, depending on, this is a comment Diane made, depending on the shapes that you're making, right? So you could use other fabrics, you could use interfacing. There's a few different techniques that bump up against each other. Very good. Love it. We talk about foundation paper piecing being backwards because the paper faces up towards you and the right side of the fabric faces down as you're stitching. And you stitch along these solid lines. So every time you add a new piece of fabric, as I was gesturing a minute ago, you have to think about how do I position it to the piece I'm sewing it to in order to get my 1/4 inch seam. But then also when I flip it open, is it going to fill that space with enough seam allowance to then be added onto, right? Talking about it in the abstract like this feels very complicated. This is exactly why I'm going to demonstrate it for you next week. So if it's such a mind bender, why bother? Like, is it worth it, right? Getting crisp edges for tiny pieces for fussy cutting is even harder with traditional pieces. It's absolutely worth it. The paper creates a guide and holds everything stable. This is also really useful, and you'll see this as I get into some examples with you. This technique is also really useful if you're wanting to create curves without curved piecing. Pieced curves, essentially, where fabric is layered on top of each other to create kind of the geometric illusion of a curve. It looks super cool. It allows you to get funky curves that would not be easily created, even with a template to cut things out, right? I love how many of you guys are like, yes, I love foundation paper piecing. Brilliant. So here's a great example. These are 1 inch square and a square blocks. These are the sashings for the Orion quilt that I made for Ian. Those little otters in the middle, that's about 1/2 inch. I would not want to have to rotary cut these ahead of time and then fiddle all these little bits together, right? Instead, I was able to kind of rough cut these otters out of fabric, pin them into the center, and then use bigger pieces of that navy fabric to create the square in a square and trim everything down, right? Yes, in theory, there's a little bit more waste, but I actually ended up with much crisper, much more precise blocks as a result, and it was easier. It really was easier than trying to fussy cut setting triangles, you know, that are 3/4 of an inch, right? Yes, Rebecca. And Rebecca, this is totally a skill that you could be working on alongside free motion quilting because you've got degrees of challenge with foundation paper piecing. So these guys are little and they are mini. There's lots of them, but they're very simple. This is a very simple design. Right? And that's much simpler than some of the examples maybe I'm going to show you in a minute. Yep. I love how Sandy's like, okay, but no, not me. Oh, Joyce has a great tip. Joyce, remind me of this next week. She glues her first piece in place. I just pin mine. I like that tip. So now that we have an understanding of like, what is foundation paper piecing and like, why the heck would we bother? What supplies do you need? Now, most of these you do not strictly need. Okay, these are the supplies that are going to make it easier. So really you can get started with just your printed template, the nice light of a window or a good task lamp like my Slimline I have over here. But if you're going to be working on a pretty significant FPP project, right? If you're working on something like Kinship, where I'm foundation paper piecing every single block of the 100 blocks, having these supplies makes it a lot easier, makes it a lot less painful, all the things, right? So first up, if you're going to be working on this for more than a block or two, you may want to consider a light box. Now, if this is your first foundation paper piecing project, you may not be ready to make this investment yet, but I want to plant the seed, because if you get that first project going, you get that first project under your belt and you're like, I want to do this technique more, this light box will save your life. So the Daylight Wafer is a lightweight, fabulous light box. It truly is about a ½ inch thick. I have mine sitting right here. You know what? This isn't cute, but I have the big one. So I'm going to reach way over here and drag it over here for you. You can see I was taking this photo, but see how thin this is, right? This is the very, very big one. This is the Wafer 3. But the Wafer 1 is like 8 by 10 inches. It's perfect for keeping right next to your sewing space. This is an LED light box, so it stores really easily. It's not the big clunky thing of light boxes past. And the other really handy thing is that Daylight actually makes a translucent cutting mat that goes right on top. So when I was making all of these square and a square blocks, and as I'll be demonstrating for you, I could put them down on the light box and line up this center bit and then trim right there on the light box, right? Because of this cutting mat. Okay, so just, oh, this is such a great point. So Sandy's like, you could use an iPad as a light box in an emergency. So do not cut on your iPad. But she's exactly right that you could get a nice bright white screen on there and kind of line it up. I also have this light here. This is, you know, less glamorous than just showing a slide deck, but it's very bright, heads up. That I use as a task lamp over my sewing machine. And for those little otters, I would just hold them up to this light and line everything up and pin it in place, right? Yeah, so a light box is a great investment. And like I said, especially if you're making a whole quilt, or if you realize, hey, I really like this technique, I want to do it more often, this is an investment that's going to keep giving back. Okay. A ruler, make it so much easier to trim a precise seam. Now, Lisa, I don't know if Lisa's here this morning. Oh, look at that. Lisa just jumped on. It's like I summoned you, darling. Lisa actually sent me this @1/4 ruler when I was doing some foundation paper piecing a couple years ago. And she was like, trust me, it'll make your life easier. And Lisa knows this. I was like, thank you, but like, I'm not super gadgety. No, she was right. Because what this ruler has a little lip on the back. So every time you add a piece to your foundation paper piecing, you then have to trim that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this makes it really easy to fold your paper back, bump this up against the edge of that paper and trim it. Whereas if you're using a regular ruler, it could slip. You could cut your fingers. Not so good. Lisa, I love that you're just chuckling, because yes, that's exactly the right reaction. So a good rotary cutter and a nice @1/4 ruler. This is such an easy investment item. Like I mentioned, the light box, bigger investment item, maybe not starting there, but definitely start here, right? Have this in your wheelhouse from the beginning. Ortho 50 weight thread, my go-to favorite, creates a minimal amount of bulk at your seams so you can press them smoothly with your wooden seam roller. Right? You're doing lots of little seams when you're foundation paper piecing. There's a time that sometimes I'll keep my iron next to me while I'm working, but more often than not, I'm just finger pressing as I go, and I'm going to hit this block with an iron at the end. And if I'm doing a lot of that, my fingers are going to get tired. So I love having this nice seam roller handy to crisp those up. Okay, so light box with translucent cutting mat. Nice rotary cutter with your @1/4 ruler. Seam roller, Ortho 50 weight, right? Most of these, maybe not most, at least some of these you probably already have in your sewing room. And if you needed to add one tool for successful foundation paper piecing, I would recommend the @1/4 ruler. Now, all the tools that I'm mentioning for you guys, that blog post I mentioned at the top that is linked in the caption of this video, there are Amazon affiliate links for all of these products linked inside that blog post to make it super easy for you to get them on their way to you, especially if this is something you want to try out with me next week, okay? So what kinds of projects can you make with foundation paper piecing? Because mostly I've just shown you guys these isolated little blocks. Now, these blocks at some point are going to become pillows. They just have not grown up yet. I've been looking at them for 2 years, waiting for them to grow up, and they haven't quite managed it. Someday the vision will strike, but I have many other finished projects that I've done with foundation paper piecing. So let's talk about this. Oh, this is brilliant. So Patricia adds there's also an add an 1/8 ruler. So if you're working with really, really tiny bits, you can have less bulky seam allowances. Great recommendation, Patricia. So Orion, this is the quilt that I made those little tiny otters for. And this is a very busy quilt. I have a lot of prints going on, but if you look closely in the sashings of this block, each sashing is Orion's belt. And there are 3 little diamonds in the belt, and that's where I put those little otters. The hexagons at the center of this block are also foundation paper piece. So you've got a hexagon with the 4 little sides of it, and that is foundation paper pieced as well. This is a quilt that it has a lot of little foundation paper piecing bits, but they're all very beginner friendly, and it's great for scrap busting. So if you're looking for a project that you're like, I want to use some little bits up, I want to try this technique out, but not be making too complicated of shapes, this is a great quilt for you. You can also make signs or quilts with words. This pattern is My First Alphabet by Diane Bond of From Blank Pages. I made custom signs for a shop here in Duluth, actually the shop where I bought this sweatshirt. It's a shop called Personify, one of my favorite little boutiques. I made sale signs and kind of final markdown signs for them using this foundation paper piece technique that I was able to make really crisp, visible text with my piecing. It was such a cool experience. Next up, you can make animals. This is a pattern from Forest Abstractions by Violet Craft. Many of you guys recognize this as the Patronus quilt that I made with Kate Brennan. She did all the piecing. I did all the quilting. I could very easily get derailed talking about the quilting, but what I want to emphasize here is the weird shapes, right? This stag has curves that, you know, in theory, you could rotary cut, but it would be weird. These would be weird templates. They would be difficult to put together. And foundation paper piecing allows you to get precise but funky shapes by putting the bits on the paper first. I'm kind of in love with this quilt, just so you know. You can make the Good as Pie placemat. I love the Good as Pie placemat. Particularly what I want to draw your attention to here is the geese in this pattern are foundation paper pieced. I love flying geese, but I hate cutting them out. Now I have an Aki quilt that helps a lot, but I love foundation paper piecing flying geese. That's how I learned how to foundation paper piece. It's one of my favorite things to do. It's just so easy. You got triangle, wings, triangle, wings, and it just, you get into a rhythm. They've never been so fun, never been so crisp. And it's so satisfying to not lose the top points on your geese. And if you want to try that technique out, this pattern is a great way. Next up, we have the fancy range backpacks. Now, the range backpack pattern is by Noodlehead. It's an absolutely phenomenal rucksack style bag. And many of you may have done the sew along with me in the spring of 2020. But what I have done here is I've actually designed 2 foundation paper piecing inserts that can go on that front zipper placket just to make it a little fancier. So there's a flying geese one, and then there's the 7 summits for my friend Grace. She has a goal of summiting the tallest mountain on every continent. So this is an interesting way that you can basically take foundation paper piecing and use it to embellish your existing projects, especially things like bags. It adds a really special touch. Then we have the Aldebaran pattern. Again, this is one of my quilt patterns. What I love about this pattern is it's a very basic form of foundation paper piecing. You start with simple string blocks, and then you cut them into the triangles to make them part of this pattern. String blocks are one of the easiest forms of foundation paper piecing because it's just one strip next to another. There's not weird shapes to be measuring. You're not usually fussy cutting, that sort of thing. So it's a wonderful introduction. And then you get to level them up into this really fun and delightful quilt. And finally, Kinship. Now, this is a pattern by Angie Wilson of Gnome Angel and Beck of Skyberries. And this is my big magnum opus that I've referenced several times this morning. These are all blocks that could be traditionally pieced, but by foundation paper piecing them, I have the opportunity to do a little bit more fussy cutting, make these edges sharper. It just up levels my piecing a little bit along the way. All right, so as you can see, foundation paper piecing is an excellent technique for quilts, bags, placemats, and other kind of table linens that just add a special touch. And especially if you're working with funky shapes like we saw with the Patronus quilt, enables you to get shapes that you would not otherwise be able to easily make with other forms of piecing. Now, unfortunately, I was not able to do questions live since we had some technical difficulties, but if you have questions, do drop them in the comments below. I want to make sure that those get answered for you. And as I mentioned at the top, there are 2 resources I want to make sure you know about. First of all is the blog at stringandstory.com/blog/how-to-FPP. We'll be working from this blog post for 2 different videos, this one here today, but also the tutorial of actually getting you started with foundation paper piecing. So the actual how do I do this? Now that I understand the why and the theory and the supplies and the how I can use it, how do I make my first foundation paper piece block? And again, several of the patterns I mentioned today are my own, and you can find those in the String and Story shop at stringandstory.com/shop. So like I mentioned, I'll see you soon for a foundation paper piecing demo so we can actually get you started. Until then, cheers, love.